All right, so we are here with Zahra Grant. And Zahra, thank you so much for being here with me today. We're just reminiscing that we actually know each other from Kitchener Waterloo, or when I was living there. Actually, I was a teenager living there, and Zahra apparently slept over at my house, my family's house, and she was friends with my sister, and just really great to have you spend some time with us today. I would love if you could say a few words about some of the great work that you do in the Muslim community, if you don't mind.
Oh, well, thank you first and foremost for inviting me to chat with you today. It's my pleasure. You've always been someone, even though we don't know each other super well, but I have fond memories of you and your family. So I'm really excited to reconnect and, build a little bit on this project and participate in this project with you that you're doing and engage in a conversation. In terms of me and my work, I always feel so I hate talking about myself, but I mean, community is very important to me. And I try to practice that in how I live my life. So activism, I feel, has always been something very near and dear to me because community is near and dear to me.
Mhm,
And I've always related that in a way to my Islam.
mhm,
Growing up in my community, fighting for justice and fighting against oppression was something foundational to how I related to my Islam.
mhm,
So that's something I've carried with me into adulthood, and I've always been fairly active, whether it's within the Black community when I was younger, around activism and reparations and empowering Black youth, and that's continued to this day. I work a lot now more with on issues pertaining to Muslim women. I'm a national board member of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, and have been quite involved with them for a number of years. I've worked on projects previously with them around issues of civic engagement and addressing issues of violence and oppression among both within Muslim communities and abroad outside of the Muslim communities, because there are, multiple intersections of oppression that we face depending on our social locations. So just
mhm.
bringing those awareness to communities and within communities. And I really believe that part of the work of justice is creating those understandings between different communities. And that's something that, I hope to be doing in the work that I do. And yeah, I have other things too. I studied in university. I have a degree in human biology and equity studies. On a professional level, I work for a health regulatory body, but really at my core is, my community and doing work for my community to better our communities. That's really
Yeah,
where my heart is.
yeah,
So
and that's so evident and so obvious. You're so friendly, and I was saying before we started recording that Zahra was very sweet to me when I was a teenager, and I remember not being very happy at that age, and you were very nice to me, and I remember some of the other girls that my sisters would bring over were not as polite as you, so it's quite obvious that you have a passion for people, and I can appreciate that. You have a lot to offer to many communities, and you mentioned that you released, or you're part of CCMW's digital anti-racism project, and I was wondering what that looks like and where we could find that.
yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's a project that, as part of the organization CCMW, we're really proud to be a part of. And part two of the project actually launched last weekend, I believe it was. And it's called DARE, Digital Anti-Racism Education Project. And it's really a project designed to, continue and build and empower communities around conversations around hate and Islamophobia, which we know is on the rise. And a lot of those discussions and a lot of that, community is found online. And
Mhm.
we're still unpacking why that people, maybe it's the safety thing of being behind a screen, but a lot of mobilization, a lot of hate is happening
Mhm.
online.
Yeah.
And but the thing is, it's manifesting in very real ways. You know what I mean? If you look
Mhm.
at the mosque shooting, if you look at, the unfortunate incidents in London where
Right.
almost a whole family was, taken away from us on this hate, the rise of, violence against Black Muslim women in Alberta, in Edmonton, like we're seeing very real consequences of this hate. That's quite prevalent and has been prevalent for a long time. I mean, these issues have always been there, right? But we're seeing an increase that is really disturbing. And so this project is really looking to not only just talk about these talk about these issues, but also give community the tools to counter these issues, inshallah. And we're sharing stories and experiences because that's part of the healing as well, and overcoming this hate, but also giving the tools to actively, advocate and fight and push back against that narrative as well.
Yeah, that's a big project, and I can definitely understand it and see how I think even just being isolated and with the pandemic and people looking for scapegoats and wanting to misplace their anger onto marginalized communities, how it would exacerbate this particular problem. And so where could we find this project?
So you can go definitely to the CCMW website. I believe it's ccmw.com. The DARE project itself also has its own website. I believe it's dare.com. We're on social media, so we're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook as well. You can look for the CCMW national page and there'll be multiple links to the project. We have workshops that are coming out or that are ongoing throughout the year. So yeah, you can definitely look it up and get involved in any way you choose to.
That's perfect. And you mentioned that you do some anti-oppression work. I've heard that used a lot, people wanting to do, like with businesses or organizations wanting to put their employees through this kind of training. And I was wondering what that looks like. Could you explain what that means?
Yeah, we're definitely living in an interesting time when we are seeing this sort of like corporatization of like the anti-oppression or EDI or all those sort of things, which is a good thing as long as it's sincere, right? And I think that's an issue that perhaps for another day, how we're seeing how all these issues are being used to now make money, which is problematic in and of itself. But my sort of commitment to anti-oppression again stems to back to my Islam, right? Islam and my faith and the way I choose to live my life is one that recognizes that, it's an honor and obligation to be living this existence. And my freedom is dependent on the freedom of those around me. And oppression is not something that should be a part of, our human relationships, in my opinion, and not just human relationships. Anti-oppression is part of our relationship to the earth. It's part of our relationship to other living creatures, animals. It's part of our relationship to each other, and it's part of our relationship to ourselves, right? So that's our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in terms of a framework in employment and in industries and in organizations, I definitely think that's something that's important, but it's more important to be something that we live by, and it's a value that we should have in how we approach our interactions with each other. For me, at least.
Well, that was great. That does sound, when I heard you speak about that so thoroughly, it does remind me of a very Islamic, some Islamic principles there. And I know that you are of a Shia background, and I think that's very interesting. I was wondering how that, or if that affects some of the work that you do, and perhaps how you're perceived in some Muslim communities.
I mean, I will definitely say my awareness of anti-oppression, I think, stems a lot from whether it was like a knowing awareness growing up, because I feel like growing up, you can't really, you don't have the words to articulate it per se. It's more like in retrospect, you're like, like I remember growing up and being very aware that Shias were sort of on the margins of like Muslims, right? Like, I mean, it happened more, I would say, in my community. I grew up in a community that was very Black Caribbean and a lot of reverts, where they reverted to Islam and then reverted to Shia Islam. And I think, pardon me?
That's interesting.
Yeah. So And there were a couple Sunnis in the mix too. So it was interesting to me. Like I grew up going to Quds Day rallies, like,
Mhm.
and having this sort of like impression of solidarity across communities from a very young age.
Mhm.
Um, at the same time, as I started, mixing with a lot of other different Muslims, I definitely began to pick up the narrative, pick up like that it wasn't quite always safe to talk about being Shia. Like I
Mhm.
fully remember even being at a camp, and not to dog other communities, I think it was like either ISNA or a Mina camp or some sort of event, and like Shias were being bashed hardcore. And I was like, ooh, better not mention that that's me, right?
Yeah.
And that was something I had to grow through too, because I remember for a point in my life actually being quite like not disclosing that part of my
Yeah.
identity for a long time. You know what I mean? Because of like the misconceptions and the
Sure.
misassociations,
Yeah.
oftentimes being told that I'm not really Muslim
Yeah.
if I'm Shia, like, you know what I mean? Those sort of things, which is really unfortunate. And I think that almost made this idea of community building across difference even more important to me,
Mhm.
because I think that really, really goes against Islamic principles
Sure.
when you
Yeah.
think about it. So the fact that this was like a common and dominant narrative to
Mhm.
say, this group of people aren't really Muslim because of this or that or the
Yeah.
other, like, that's not our place to make those judgments and those
No,
calls.
it isn't. It certainly
So,
isn't. But there is a lot of unfortunate infighting between um, you know,
definitely.
different sects of Islam, which is too bad. You are Malaysian and Trinidadian, if I'm not.
No, you got it.
Okay, awesome. And so I was wondering which of those two identities you identify more or less with, and which of those has played a role in your faith.
That's such an interesting question. Yeah, well, my mother is Chinese Malaysian and my father is Trinidadian. They met here in Toronto. I always say I'm one of the original mixies. And it's interesting because my parents actually split when I was less than 2 years old. So I actually didn't grow up with my mother at all. So I very much am rooted in sort of my Caribbean, Trinidadian, Black identity, while also recognizing a lot of the privileges that come with being a mixed child, right? Like I have a sort of like ability, especially depending on how I wear my hijab or how I
Yeah.
present, I can sort of like be a bit of a chameleon across communities where like I'm a little bit ambiguous,
I think
which I think has revealed a lot about, a lot of the problems with anti-Blackness and racism within our communities as well, because I was able to be privy to a lot of conversations unwittingly that, are very much rooted in anti-Blackness. Meanwhile, I come from a very, very Black culture, right? So, yeah, I definitely identified to those issues a little bit more because those are the people I grew up with, and those are the people who took care of me, and those are the people I love.
a
Whether
question
it's
for you.
that, yeah.
Where do you think the anti-Blackness in Muslim communities really comes from?
I think, I mean, that's such a hard question to answer. I mean, colonization definitely is a huge factor in how we understand our world. Like colonization has hit every crevice of the planet. And in terms of worldview, unfortunately, that's something that's quite dominant in our ways of approaching the world. So, and that has unfortunately it's very much prevalent within the Muslim world as well, whether that's in Arabia, whether that's on the Indian continent, and even within the continent of Africa itself. Like we're seeing anti-Blackness quite in alarming ways, even among Muslim communities. Like I
Mhm.
think about even last year around like when we were seeing this sort of global revival around these issues, where we're seeing anti-Blackness talked about on very like widespread platforms right across the world, and yet within Muslim communities we're having these conversations around like are protests halal or haram, like
Yeah.
really, like what, like how is that what you're worried about right now, right? So it can be quite shocking, but it's not really surprising, unfortunately.
Well, they don't, it's kind of like a laziness, right?
Yeah.
To say something like that. That's interesting that you're also Malaysian. That's, also a predominant Muslim country? Is
It's
that
a predominantly Muslim country. So I ended up meeting my mom in my late teens and that side of the family, and it was really interesting to learn that I actually feel like I would fit in pretty well in Malaysia. Like I was like, oh, okay. And that is, it's funny, like when people ask what I am and I say Malaysian, they kind of think, oh, that's why you're Muslim. And it's like, no, actually I'm Muslim because of my convert father.
Mhm.
Um, and very much tied to Black liberation. That's how he found his Islam,
Oh,
right? So it's interesting to sort of navigate that sometimes. But I mean, I love it. I bring it on, and
yeah,
anyway, we could start the conversations. It's all good.
yeah.
So yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I find Malaysia has a very interesting approach to Islam. I mean, I feel like they're getting a little bit more conservative.
Mhm.
These
I've
days, which
noticed that.
is interesting, but yeah, and I don't know too much about the politics in Malaysia, but I remember first learning about Malaysia and thinking like they have an approach to Islam that I feel fits a lot more to how, you know, I would like to see the world approach it, but that's constantly shifting as well. So yeah, but it's interesting.
Very interesting. You're right. I also was making an assumption in my mind, oh, because your mom, that's probably how got your faith. And I'm also mixed, so I also have a lot of I can relate to what you were saying as kind of being this ambiguous
Mhm.
chameleon. No one ever really knows
Can
where
you?
to categorize you, to really think about you. Um, one of the reasons why I'm chatting with you today is because you are a public supporter of LGBTQ rights, and that is very, very taboo. And I have a couple questions for you about that. One, why? And two, do you receive criticism for that stance?
Such a good question. I mean, yeah, I'm definitely supportive. I feel like I've become more vocal in my support more in the past few years. And it was sort of like because I felt like it was important. Like, I feel like that's something for me that has never been an issue, especially my understand the way I understand sort of anti-oppression and the concept of justice.
Mhm.
Um, but I have made a point to be more vocal and present that was an intentional thing for me, just because it is such a prevalent and taboo issue in Islam,
Mhm.
unfortunately, and within Muslim communities. And it's sad to me, right? I have family members that identify with that community. And so these are people I love and are being harmed and are being like shamed about something they really shouldn't. And it's really none of anybody's business. Like, I don't understand why it should be an issue. And I mean, I've definitely gotten those remarks, whether it's from people close to me as to why I choose to be vocal about it, whether it's people not so close to me responding to stories like with their little question marks, where aren't you Muslim, or this seems to be against Islamic principles.
Yeah.
And you know what? I actually welcome those type of comments because I'm happy to share the little that I know or direct them to people that know better on why, you know, that the criticism or the judgments that are coming from them is one, inappropriate and un-Islamic.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is something that I'm very intentional about and hope to engage my fellow Muslims and peers to
Mhm.
help understand and know each other better, because that's what we're commanded by Allah to do, you know, like we're commanded to know each other. And then knowing is not just like, oh, I'm going to have dinner with someone, or no, knowing is fighting for their justice and liberation as much as you fight for yours.
That's interesting. One like more of I guess a conservative view might say, well, it's like in our faith to basically I don't want I guess it's a type of um I guess to not promote, this type of I mean just the what you're saying is that it's unjust
Mhm.
to oppress LGBTQ people, but others would argue that it's actually something that is against Islam, right? So it's it's a very difficult subject to to open up, because when we talk about something like racism, there's no in like theologically, it's not in our faith to be
Mhm.
racist, but people would argue that they use the story of Lot, for example, to say that this is a clear example. And I've heard it so many times. This is why it's so clear. It's so obvious as to why this is forbidden.
Mhm. I mean, I would respond to that and say, like, I mean, we're projecting a lot of our understandings of now back onto the scripture. And it's always important to bring text into context. I totally agree that, I mean, the Lot story is used all the time, right? But even if you look at that story in the Quran, and I mean, I'm not a scholar, so I can't say I'm saying this from a position of authority, but you can definitely look this up in terms of when you really break down that story. It's about consent, and it's about the abuse of power in that context. And I mean, I could get how people might interpret it a different way and even come to that conclusion. But if you look at the narrative and the themes of the Quran, which is abundant in its themes of treating people with justice, with its themes of anti-oppression, to stand firm for justice, be it against yourselves, be it against your family. These are themes that are consistent across the Quran. So when you bring an incident, like, you have to understand the context of that incident, right? And how it actually was an issue of justice, not an issue of judging, and not an issue of, like, even, inclinations to same-sex relationships. Because if you look then also at, the stories and the hadith around that time, third genders existed. I can't remember what they're called, like mukannatun or something like that. Is the Salama, which was one of the wives of the Prophet, may peace and blessings be upon, like, had a servant that was identified as this, that wasn't, I think they called them like effeminate. Effeminate, and they're not attracted to women. Like, these are clearly queer characters. Like, yes, but correct. Of course, again, we're projecting our language now back to that time. Like, there wasn't this concept of identifying along lines of sexuality back there. That's why you don't see directives addressing that specifically. But if you look at Muslim communities, if you look at the literature, like, we see queer people all over the place, and they're not treated indifferently. Like, we have stories of the Prophet ﷺ interacting with people like this, and if they are getting chastised, it has nothing to do with their inclinations or their identities, right? It has to do with, like, even that same servant of Salama's, they got in trouble for gossiping, right? Not
sharing stories about the women.
Yeah. So these are so when you come, if you want to cherry pick Islam and use that to justify treating someone poorly or treating someone with injustice or justifying someone's oppression, I'm sorry, that's really your issue that you're going to have to sort out with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but that's not the way I approach my faith. And it's the only thing I can contribute is to advise people to not be so myopic in how they approach their Islam, because look how Islam has also been justified to oppress women, like, you know what I mean? So that's another unfortunate thing. And these are things that are the problems of men, to be honest, like, and how they've interpreted and how they've standardized like women's voices and queer voices and voices on the margins, which is actually a very welcome concept in Islam if we think about it. Like, differences of opinion is something that's built into Islamic culture. Like, these are foundational principles to me. Like, it's okay to have different understandings. That's actually a very Islamic value, as long as it's rooted in the concept of tawheed, that we're all connected, and that we should always be, justice should be at the root of all we do, and that's a form of worship.
Absolutely. Very very well said. And you're right. I think the cherry picking is something that most people do, right? And it's
to find out more, it's easier.
Well, yeah, it's interesting how, there are some contentious verses that get a lot of people will contextualize, they'll research, they'll do their due diligence on, but when it comes to same-sex unions, it's a red line, and there's no There's,
And it's such a vague, obscure story. Like, I mean, it is a story that's there and like that's recorded in the scripture, but like there are different ways of approaching and that actually make more sense than, if you look at the broader theme of, Islamic principles and values. So yeah, people gonna do what they gonna do.
So it's one thing if you have a passion for anti-oppression and for speaking up for LGBTQ people, but you also said that your organization CCMW is committed to tackling homophobia, and I'm very curious as to what this entails and what that looks like.
Well, for now, we are a very project-based organization. So a lot of times our work and our projects are sort of, framed along those whatever specific project we're working on at the time. But as an organization, we're definitely, that's something we're committed to. Like, for example, even in a lot of our projects, we're this Canadian Council of Muslim Women, but we make a point to include that when we say Muslim women, that it's inclusive of trans women and non-binary folk as well. So we had non-binary folk be involved in the latest phase of the Digital Anti-Racism Project, where we had shared videos of people just sharing their stories and their experiences to help build that conversation and that awareness across communities and hopefully bring some healing as well. So yeah, it's just a principle that we apply to our work. We're involved with, queer organizations, Salam, there's Queer Muslim Network. So that it's something that's very important to us to bring a voice to and to make sure those voices are included in the work we do.
I think that's great. I was canceled from Queer and Muslim Network.
Oh, were you? That's not funny at all, but
yeah, I just it's a separate subject, but some of these unfortunately, I think what happens is even if you do fit the bill for identity, if you have a unique way of thinking, then you're out.
well, I'm sorry that happened to you. That is unfortunate, but inshallah, that doesn't stop.
Not at all. Not at all. My next question.
And that's sometimes you have to do too. That's something sometimes you have to do. You have to just say, you know what? Continue doing your work, because that doesn't diminish the work they're doing, and that doesn't diminish the work you're doing. You know what I mean? Both are important, and just say alhamdulillah, like lessons learned, and we keep it pushing.
Yeah. Well, it's not new for me personally. I'm pretty much, I feel like I'm blacklisted from all Muslim organizations, period. No. Yeah. And for me, either I don't fit in because of the things that my unique perspectives, or for my identity, one part of my identity is never seen because I'm also Kurdish. And that's a very inconvenient identity to exist as well as being, a homo. So it's challenging. But anyways, my next question to you was, what is your personal favorite Muslim organization?
My personal favorite Muslim organization. I mean, I don't know if I really have one. I have to big up CCMW, of course, because that's an organization I'm proud of.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about that, because I did notice that they on the stories they were sharing this gay guy. I think he was like a baker or something, and he was saying like, I want to shout out CCMW. I know what it's like to be marginalized, and I want to praise them, or something like that. And I found that interesting, like that a lot of I see this often, that sometimes Muslim organizations will accept help from gays outside the community, but from inside, they just kind of ignore us. Because I did ask them a question about if they were working with gay Muslims, and they always, and not just CCMW, but a lot of organizations they're very concerned with their answer and having like this copy and paste answer for me as
Mhm.
to, you know, how they're inclusive and all this stuff, instead of actually engage with me. So I usually find myself, for me personally, that they often turn me away. Um,
Hmm.
so it is nice to hear that, you know, CCMW is engaging more. I
Yeah, I'm
guess,
sorry you experienced that. I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of the organization for sure. I'm speaking more from what I personally hope to bring to the table, and will definitely like try to hold, because organizations aren't perfect, communities will make mistakes. But for me, what's important is the accountability factor and the commitment to continue doing the work, right?
Mhm.
And acknowledging when you've messed up sincerely. So I'm sorry you've experienced any sort of ostracization or, invalidation from whether it was CCMW or any other or Muslim organization. But that is an unfortunate reality. I mean,
Yeah,
these even anti-blackness within the
for
organization,
sure.
something.
They'll do it covertly, right? Not.
Right. So, I mean, and this is something that's not unique to CCMW or any other organization for that matter. But yeah, I mean, from a personal perspective in terms of my favorite, I like a lot of Musawa is a really great global organization. They do a lot of work around like feminist interpretations of the Quran, and approaching, like the issues women experience living under Muslim laws and things like that. And I find them really revolutionary in their approach and their understandings of Islam. I find inspiration from them. Muslim Arc in the States, I find that do really great work around anti-racism. Um, I love a lot of like the younger up and comer, like digital, I wouldn't say organizations, but more like grassroots communities that are online, like the Digital Sisterhood and their podcast. I love them. And yeah, I just love seeing women and people on the margins and people who, maybe would be dismissed within Islamic communities just
Mhm.
speak up for themselves and claim their Islam too. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, I completely get why a lot of people would reject Islam,
Mhm.
because our community doesn't do a good job of being inclusive,
No, it doesn't.
whether that's of women, like the fact that we still have closet, spaces for women and sending women to dark alleys to go enter the masjid. Like,
Mhm.
it's really sad. So I can completely, like, even myself, I consider myself a bit unmosqued because a lot of mosques I don't feel welcome in, to be
Mhm.
honest. But I'm a very proud Muslim, and my Islam is very important to me. So I say let people judge me however they want to judge me, but I'm gonna still continue to do the work. And guess what? I'm probably gonna still fight for you too. Like,
That's amazing.
so, and that's just kind of how I approach everything.
That's great. What you're doing is needed, and you know, as a gay person, seeing another Muslim just, you know, mention something that's not violent towards gays, or you know, something nice, it means a lot to not just me, but probably a lot of other people that are don't have the confidence to open up about that. We talked about a lot of serious stuff, and so I want to get to know you a little bit more, and lighten it up. And I want to know about what your favorite foods are, and I also know that you're a book lover, and I would love to know what you like to read.
Ooh, I definitely do love to eat, and I definitely do love to read. I will say, like, my favorite foods is really Trinidadian food. Like, I love a dish called kalaloo, which is like kalaloo leaves and okra stewed down in like coconut and pumpkin, and that with some stewed chicken on
Mhm.
some kuku, which is like a cornmeal type of dish. Like, I could eat that every day. I will say Malaysian food is bomb too. Like, Malaysian food is really good.
Yeah.
In terms of favorite books, I mean, that's such a hard question. I'm an
Are you a fiction or a
I'm a
nonfiction?
voracious reader. I love both, to be honest. When I'm reading nonfiction, um, I am a little bit nerdy. Like, I like the sort of existential, like metaphysical stuff. I love Sayyid Hossein Nasr. I love Sashika Murata. I love Lale Bakhtiar. May God rest her soul. She actually does an amazing translation of the Quran. And she's probably, I think, the first American woman maybe to do a translation of Quran, if not the only woman. I'm not 100% positive of that, but you should definitely check out her translation of the Quran. Getting on the more lighter side of things, I love science fiction. I love Octavia Butler. She's like real, I call her my mama. She's like, her writing has done so much for me, especially for, you know, people who experience oppression and want to envision a different world. I think she's a great escape for me. Toni Morrison, of course, has been foundational to her works are just so important to me. Zadie Smith, I love as well. She has a hilarious book, actually, White Teeth, that if you're Muslim, a lot of her humor, like she approaches humor and just like things within little like nuances within the Islamic community and within Muslim community, she incorporates into that novel, at least, White Teeth, which is really fun. Honestly, I could talk about books all day, but yeah, those are just some of the faves.
A question for you about pone cake. I know.
A pone, that is, girl, you know it. That is my favorite dessert.
Is that really Trinidadian? Because a lot of other Caribbeans will argue that it's theirs. The Guyanese say that it's theirs. The Jamaican.
Well, Guyanese always also want to say goat curry or whatever. Like, they're a little backwards. Don't listen. Don't listen.
Well, great. I'm gonna definitely make sure that there's some Caribbean food for you on Sunday at our second party.
I'm so excited to see you in person again, inshallah.
I am as well. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for sharing all that you did today, and really looking forward to speaking with you again soon.
No, it's my true honor. I mean, like I said, a foundational part of like community building is just having conversation like these and just sharing where we're coming from. We're all coming from different locations and experiences, but understanding that they're all valid. You know what I mean? People, we get so caught up. And I think honestly, it's a violence of colonialism. Like, it's okay to like have pride and like be proud of yourself and proud of where you come from. But when you start to invalidate others' experiences and hierarchize like, you know, identities in these destructive and oppressive ways, that's where we lose our Islam, actually. And it's really sad and important. So I think, you know, being part of these conversations is how we sort of push back against those type of narratives, and inshallah build communities and continue to do good work. So it was a true honor to be here and have this conversation with you, and I look forward to many more off camera.
I do as well. Very well and beautifully said, Zahra.
Thank you. And thank you for pronouncing my name so beautifully. You know what, just as a little side note, I mean, it's so funny because I mean, even I pronounce my name like Zahra sometimes, just because it's just easier for people to say. Right. If I say Zahra, it's like, what? And it just, but it's something that I'm really trying to intentionally also work on, pronounce it properly, let it roll off the tongue the way it should, allow people, like correct people when they do it wrong. But thank you for.
Yeah, there's a H in there. I said it the Caribbean way.
Yes. H. Love it.
Great chatting with you.
Yes, you as well. Take care, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.